Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our series of live video presentations with Lunch with the Friends. I'm Chris Knopp, Executive Director of Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness, and I want to begin by wishing all of you well. I know these are still trying times here. I hope all of you are staying safe and staying healthy. We are all in this together, and we'll get through this together. For over 40 years, Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness has been the leader in protecting the boundary waters, and we've been the leader because of you. We're based on our supporters, and our supporters will always be the strength of our organization. Today, our work focuses on three areas: wilderness, people, and community. For the wilderness, there are two mines and one threat that threaten the boundary waters today. And those two threats are PolyMet and twin metals, and PolyMet is the subject of today's presentation. And through legislation, litigation, and community action, we're working to prevent sulfide mines from destroying the boundary waters. For people, through our No Boundaries to the Boundary Waters program, we are connecting students all across Minnesota to the boundary waters through classroom education and now online programs and scholarships for wilderness canoe trips. For community, we recognize that the communities that are gateways to the boundary waters and the wilderness itself have a shared fate. And we are working on actions that make those communities strong and thrive into the future. And on that note, we are looking to hire a Boundary Waters Community Coordinator that would be based in Ely. And so if you are interested in that position, please look on our website at that job posting. Today's presentation is by John Gappa, a retired CFO and the board chair of Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. My co-host is Lee Vu. Lee is a distinguished paddler and also a member of the board of Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. In the past, we've looked at the threats to the environment that PolyMet poses. Today's presentation is a bit different. Today's presentation looks at the threat that PolyMet poses to our pocketbook. Glencore, the owner of PolyMet, plans to fleece Minnesota's taxpayers. And the head in the sand, the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil approach of top elected officials and regulators cannot stand on this matter. A few housekeeping matters before I turn this over to John. You cannot speak during this presentation, but you can communicate. At the bottom of your screen, there's a question and answer tab and a chat tab. Please use those to present questions, and we can have John answer those at the end of the presentation if we cannot answer those. So without further ado, John, please take it from here.
All right, thank you, Chris. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. You know, today I'm going to talk about the threat of the Glencore-PolyMet copper sulfide mine to northern Minnesota, and also specifically talk about the risks that this project presents to Minnesota taxpayers. So I'm part of a group of financial executives that have been involved in this project for about the past 6 years, looking at the financial aspects of the proposed mine. Joining me in this group is Ron Sternal and Alan Tolmitz, both seasoned financial executives and passionate wilderness guys. And both Ron and Alan also serve on the board of one of our partner organizations, the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And we had the opportunity to meet, and we actually testified at the one and only Minnesota House legislative hearing on copper sulfide mining in Minnesota. And that was back in 2014. And since that time, the three of us have met with countless officials in the state, including officials with the Minnesota DNR, other state agencies, and numerous elected officials. And as an avid wilderness canoer and cabin owner on the Gunflint Trail, I got involved with the Friends about 8 years ago. You know, and back then, when I was learning about sulfide mining, I thought really you had to be a lawyer or a scientist to somehow get involved in this issue and make a difference. And what I've learned since that time in working with the Friends, that there's actually many avenues in which citizens such as myself, or as many of you, can make a difference to help protect the wilderness. So I'd now like to kind of outline for you what the two mines, one threats are to the precious waters of northern Minnesota. So on this map here of the Minnesota Arrowhead, down here by just south of the town of Babbitt and north of Aurora, this is the proposed PolyMet mine site. And a little bit further north here is the Twin Metal site. So these represent the two mines that are threatening northern Minnesota. And looking at this here, the PolyMet mine site is at the headwaters of the Partridge River, which then drains into the St. Louis River. And you can see this brown area here represents the area that will be affected by the acid mine drainage. So following the St. Louis River down, it then meets up with the Fond du Lac Reservation before it continues its way to dump into Lake Superior. So that's the primary path of pollution from the PolyMet mine. And also there's been, as you might imagine, there's pretty complex hydrology in this whole area in northern Minnesota. Running along sort of a kind of a jagged line here is the Continental Divide or the Laurentian Divide. And this is the point of land, essentially the height of land, where waters south of the Continental Divide flow south and east and north of that line will flow north into the Rainy Rivers watershed, or sometimes also known as the Boundary Waters watershed. Now, the PolyMet mine is, literally a rock's throw from the Continental Divide. And tribal scientists have actually run some complex water models that have shown that depending on some of the conditions in nearby taconite mines, that groundwater in particular could flow north from the PolyMet mine north into the Boundary Waters watershed. So, that really represents kind of the two key threats, the two mines that are posing one threat to Minnesota waters. The acid mine drainage that comes from a copper sulfide mine. Now, I'll show you a picture here. This is a picture of the Partridge River. And this is the river that PolyMet will drain into. And interesting part of this is that this whole area here is comprised of northern rich spruce swamp wetlands. And PolyMet is proposing to destroy 900 acres of these rare wetlands to build their mine site. And this is the largest destruction of wetlands in Minnesota history if it were to occur. And you can see from this picture here is that while outside of the Boundary Waters area, this is one of the most beautiful and remote areas in Minnesota. And just given the access to it, it's actually somewhat difficult to get into, which makes it quite a remote and wild area. So during my discussion today, I'm going to talk about 4 key risks to Minnesota taxpayers. One is that the state of Minnesota could be stuck with $1 billion cleanup bill as a result of an improper structure of financial assurance for this project. The second of all is that the actual economics of these mines are very poor given the low quality of ore that's being mined. And with inadequate financial returns, it really provides an incentive for the mining companies to cut corners. Third, we'll talk about who is Glencore and PolyMet, and what you'll see is that they're quite shaky business partners, and these are folks, unfortunately, that the state and folks are kind of pinning their hopes on, and it presents a significant risk of a failed mining project. And then finally, we'll talk about really the company behind the curtain, which is Glencore, and the fact that really PolyMet is essentially just their shell company for this mining project, and also talk about the issue that the state of Minnesota is actually not even holding Glencore responsible or liable for this project. So during this discussion, I'm going to use the term financial assurance, and that is just simply the damage deposit that mining companies are required to put up to clean up after themselves. And a big issue that you'll see in this whole issue is the fact that Minnesota regulators are not requiring cash up front for this damage deposit. And without that cash up front, that presents the risk of a huge cleanup risk to Minnesota taxpayers. So Minnesota law is actually very specific as it relates to the financial assurance requirements or the damage deposit for non-ferrous mines, such as copper nickel mines. And some of the key requirements is that the companies post funds to cover the cost of closure of the dam and reclamation of the mine site and any ongoing water treatment site. It requires that these estimates are reviewed annually and that the funds are available to the state and essentially bankruptcy proof to the state, and that the whole plan eventually be approved by the commissioner of the DNR for Minnesota. And this gets into a lot of complications that I won't bore you with today, but some of the specifics of these laws is what myself and my associates have been digging through and pouring through over the last 6 years. So I want to talk about the financial aspects of this, and I'll explain this graph to you here. And what this graph represents, the peak of the line of the graph here, this represents the cleanup costs of the PolyMet project at various stages. So right now, and this is the stage that we're in now, this is what they call the pre-construction stage. The PolyMet site is currently a former taconite processing facility, and there's approximately $75 million in legacy cleanup liabilities that's associated with that site. When or if the mine is actually developed, the moment the sulfide ore is exposed to the elements, it creates an immediate cleanup burden of almost $600 million. And essentially that's the cost of having to deal with the acid-bearing rock that's exposed to the elements. That cleanup cost grows to over $1 billion at the peak of mine exploration. So this is essentially the point after 10 or 11 years that the mine site is fully developed. The cost decreases slightly over time as part of the mine site is backfilled with tailings, but upon closure, the estimated cost to remediate the site and provide ongoing water treatment is over $780 million. And then once cleanup is actually completed at the end here of kind of year 23, an additional $580 million is needed to maintain ongoing water treatment site from this project. Basically, you're going to have a large tailings dam that will leak, acid mine drainage water, and you need to have a water treatment plant in place to clean that up. So that's the costs of it. And now, with regard to the financial assurance, the state, unfortunately, is not requiring the mining company to submit cash on the barrelhead to clean up this project. So this orange part of the graph represents how PolyMet is being allowed by the state to finance the financial assurance. And they're allowing the state to rely on these complex financial instruments known as surety bonds and letters of credit. And once again, I won't go into the details of why this is a bad idea to the state. In summary, these are short-term instruments necessary to finance a long-term cleanup. And also, you'll see in a minute that the cash contributions to this cleanup fund are actually delayed until the second half of the project. So at the time when there's $1 billion cleanup liability facing the state, there's only about $23 million in the trust fund. And the trust fund really does not start building until the second half of the project. Now, a key issue related to that is that the state is allowing Glencore and other investors to get paid first before Minnesota taxpayers are protected from the financial liability of this project. So this graph here represents the cash flow that the mining project is estimated to produce in each year of its life. And this is data that was supplied by PolyMet to their investors as part of a Canadian securities filing. So this is, something that they've made as a public document. And as what they're saying is that in the first years of mining, the cash flow that the project will produce, range anywhere from about $150 million a year to almost $200 million a year during the first 9 years of mining. And during these years of mining, the state is letting Glencore siphon off all that cash to pay themselves and is only requiring a $2 million annual contribution to the trust fund during the most profitable years of mining. Now, in the second half of the mine life, years kind of 10 through 20, is when the trust fund payments kick in. And you can see this is at the time when some of the better ore is actually mined, so the mine is less profitable, and then almost half of the cash flow from the mine will have to go into the trust fund. Well, you can kind of imagine what the conversation that's going to happen by the mining company at this point in time. They're going to say, well, gee, I'm not sure we could make these payments. You better let us forego these payments or else, we're going to have to shut down the mine. So the state has put themselves in a significant disadvantage by favoring the mining companies over Minnesota taxpayers. Which really raises the question, why should Glencore be paid first for this project? You see this graph here also represents the funding of the trust fund. So once again, the first 9 years of operation, the trust fund is only 3% funded. And then, the funding doesn't grow really until the back half of the mine when, the time period when this mine is actually much less profitable. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what financial assurance covers. So all of these estimates, and what the requirements are by the state is that financial assurance assumes everything goes right with regard to, operating the mine. So this trust fund that you see, whether it's $500 million or $1 billion, that's just to clean up the costs according to the company's own estimates and does not provide any protection at all to taxpayers from a catastrophic event such as a dam collapse. And we know that these dams do collapse. There's been two, similar type of dams that have collapsed in recent history. The Brumadinho mine in Brazil killed over 200 people when their mine collapsed. And the Mount Poly dam occurred in British Columbia, where a large earthen dam collapsed and flooded a pristine mountain lake. So what we know from the cost of those catastrophic disasters is that they're enormous costs. The Brumadinho project alone is estimated to be at least a $6 billion disaster. And while the state is required to ensure that an adequate environmental liability coverage is in place for this mining project, the state has really been unclear as far as how much environmental liability insurance they're going to require. Currently, they're requiring $10 million in a pre-construction phase, but they haven't said how much they're going to require if construction is allowed. And another question is that given the riskiness of these dams, can the company even obtain a level of $6 billion or more of environmental liability insurance? And if they're unable to obtain that insurance, the risk falls on to Minnesota taxpayers. So another issue is that with this project, given the complexity of it, the DNR, to their credit, hired outside experts to advise them on the financial assurance structure. But the problem is that they really didn't listen to them, and the DNR's own outside experts have significant issues with the structure of this project, and have said that without that PolyMet may not even be able to obtain the complex financial instruments that they're relying on to provide the financial assurance. And that also, the fact that there's no cash up front into the trust fund presents a significant risk to the state. The other issue that the state's experts pointed out is the fact that this project is marginally viable, even under the best assumptions. You know, the outside experts, said it's marginal at best. It also is relying on some pretty shaky assumptions, including copper prices that are 22% above 5-year averages and actually significantly above where the current copper prices are. And also the most curious thing about this is that the returns on this project that PolyMet is representing to their investors don't assume any cash funding of the trust fund. So what they've promised to the DNR is that they would make cash payments to the trust fund, but they're telling their investors that to earn their returns, they actually don't have to make those trust fund payments. Which become, essentially what that begs the question is PolyMet lying to the state, or are they lying to their own investors? Let you kind of be the judge of that. The other issue is that PolyMet has also disclosed the fact that in order for the mine to actually meet, strong returns, the way to do that is to make the mine 4 times the size that it's currently permitted, which essentially is representing a bait and switch, where they're representing to the state that they're going to build a small mine, and they're representing to their investors that they're going to build a very big mine. And in a recent court decision, the Minnesota Court of Appeals, in a challenge to PolyMet's air permit, declared that permit a sham permit because of this bait and switch tactic that PolyMet is using. So also talking about the financial returns. So this graph here, the blue line of the graph represents copper prices over the last 20 years. And you can see this period of time here in the early to mid 2000s, where copper prices spiked. This was known as the commodity super cycle. This is the time when oil prices reached $150 a barrel. Today it's trading at about 30. And this orange line here represents the break-even price that PolyMet needs for this mine to be even marginally profitable. And you could see that, over the last 2 years, copper prices have fallen below their break-even price. And this graph goes to the end of 2019. And now if you were to look at copper prices today, as the economy has collapsed due to the COVID crisis, prices have fallen to about $2.30 a pound for copper, still significantly below what's necessary to make this be a profitable project. What we know about marginal projects is that it provides an incentive for mining companies to cut corners. So let's talk about who the actors are in this endeavor. So PolyMet is essentially Glencore's shell company. PolyMet is actually a Canadian company, despite what they like to tell us during the state high school hockey tournament. They're known as what's called a Canadian Junior Mining Company, which is a publicly traded company in Canada with the sole purpose of exploring mining sites. They have no operations or income and have lost money every year since their existence. Their sole purpose is to develop the PolyMet mine, and they have been dependent on Glencore for all of their financing of this project. And the only assets of PolyMet is the undeveloped mine site and the former LTV taconite processing facility that they plan to use to process the copper sulfide ore. So really, the man behind the curtain here is Glencore. And Glencore is the world's largest integrated commodities trading and mining company. They have mining operations all over the world, including a large extent of coal mines. They do a lot of oil trading, cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also they're one of the leading copper mining companies across the world. Now, Glencore has a rather notorious reputation. They were formed by the notorious financier Mark Rich, who was convicted of trading oil and violating the Iranian oil embargo. Their current chairman is Tony Hayward, who's the former CEO of British Petroleum. And if you remember Tony Hayward, he's the man who wanted his life back as the Deepwater Horizon oil spill poured billions of gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And Tony just needed to get back to his yacht. And so Tony is the man presenting the tone at the top with Glencore. So those are the folks who we're relying on to protect Minnesota's waters. Glencore is also under investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice for bribery and corruption allegations. And they have already pled guilty and paid a $30 million fine to the Ontario Securities Commission for misleading investors. They also have a very poor environmental record around the world, and particularly very poor labor relations record around the world as well. So those are our business partners. So the other thing about Glencore is that even though Glencore is controlling the shell company PolyMet, the state hasn't required Glencore to be on the permits for this, nor to assume any of the financial liability for the PolyMet mine, despite the fact that Glencore owns the substantial majority of PolyMet stock, has been providing all the capital to keep them afloat, provides much of their technical mine advice, controls the board of directors, and also controls 100% of the minerals that the mine will produce. So, you know, the question I keep asking is that if Glencore isn't agreeing to be on the permits and assume this liability, what do they know that we don't? Now, as part of the project that a group of us had put together regarding these issues, is that one of the things that we were able to do is that we filed a friend of the court brief in regard to one of the lawsuits challenging the PolyMet permits. And the friend of the court brief was also filed and joined with former Governor Arne Carlson, who provided us some significant advice and insights into this brief. And essentially our arguments were much of the arguments that I just made in the last several slides here about the issues with the financial assurance. And the Court of Appeals actually agreed with our arguments and have ordered the DNR to hold a contested case hearing on these financial assurance issues, which will allow the Friends and MCEA and our partners to bring expert witnesses and actually hold a public trial on these and the other issues related to the PolyMet mine. Now, unfortunately, the state decided to join PolyMet and appeal this case to this Minnesota court, to the Minnesota Supreme Court, and so we'll have our day in court with the Minnesota Supreme Court later this year. The good news is that the PolyMet project is on hold as a result of the legal victory of the Friends and MCEA and the Fond du Lac Band Water Legacy. So this project cannot be developed until all these legal issues are resolved, hopefully to our satisfaction. But what we do know is that the legal victories are incredibly important, but that lasting protection of Minnesota's waters ultimately must come from political support. And that political support really comes from people like all of you who are listening today. So the question is, what can you do to help address these issues? You know, first of all, tell Governor Walz to stop the PolyMet and Twin Metals mine project. We would also ask you to tell your legislator to pass Prove It First legislation. This would protect Lake Superior and the boundary waters from copper sulfide mining. And also tell all your friends, associates about the two mines and one threat to Minnesota's waters from the PolyMet mine and the Twin Metals and copper sulfide mining proposals. So thank you for listening today. I will now be taking questions, and Chris will be relaying your questions to me. And I'd also like to introduce the next Friends with the Lunch with the Friends will be coming up on June 3rd. Noted author and Dan Polly and former board chair of the Friends will be offering tips and tricks for planning your next Boundary Waters trip. So Chris, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, John, for that presentation. One question, perhaps going back to that, if you could move your presentation back to that table that shows the financial liability over time, kind of going back to that table over time here. So that one there. So there are a couple questions relating to this, and so. First, John, so this doesn't have to deal with the cost of a catastrophe, right? This is just as the sort of cost and reclamation costs if things go as planned, right?
Right, yeah. It assumes everything goes right with this project.
Okay, and so there was a question about that $588 million at the beginning there. So what we have at the beginning with the $75 million, that's to clean up the mess that was made by the previous taconite mine. So that's what that's about.
Right, right.
Okay, and then so as they kind of begin to expose that rock that would create the acid runoff, what does that $588 million represent?
So, essentially what would happen at this point is that they would strip the overburden from the mine site, and then they would, essentially begin blasting of the copper sulfide ore. So it would be to essentially tear down all the buildings that they just built. There's like a 16-mile railroad that would be torn up, that would have to be removed and remediated. But the biggest issue is that they would have to cover up this pit, and then the exposing of the ore will result in permanent acid mine drainage because the sulfur-bearing rock has been exposed to the elements. So it provides for really, water treatment of the area for hundreds of years.
Okay, and John, continuing to look at that chart there. So at the end, that 580 million, explain again what that money's for.
Yeah. So just to kind of step through it, so that 780 million. At this point in time, the site has to be reclaimed. So essentially returned to the way it was prior to mining. So it's removing the facilities and the rail yards and things that were built, and so once it's all put back together, the $580 million is to provide for the ongoing operation of water treatment facilities to treat the discharges of the acid mine drainage. So essentially, you're left with a 900-acre lake that's filled with, essentially mine waste, and that that tailings dam that's holding that 900-acre lake back will be draining essentially into perpetuity. So, because of that, the $580 million is to really manage the cost of that drainage in perpetuity. Now, those of us on the financial side, I've never, in my history, had to provide for the management of something that lasts hundreds of years. When we've developed manufacturing plants and things, they have a 20 to 40 year life. And even then, 20 to 40 years is pretty hard to see into the future. 100 years, 200 years or more is virtually impossible to plan for and to finance.
So what we have here is a forever permit for a 900-acre lake of toxic wastewater, and it'll be held back by an earthen dam that's as tall as the Statue of Liberty forever. And what we have is $580 million to last forever, right?
Right. And it's actually hard to even imagine what does a 900-acre lake look like. As a reference point, if you were to take Bede-Makaska, Lake Harriet, and Lake Phelan and put all three of them together, that's a 900-acre lake. So imagine that, imagine the picture I showed you right here that replaced this beautiful scene with a 900-acre lake filled with, toxic mine waste, being held back by an earthen dam as tall as the Statue of Liberty. And that's what's protecting the city of Duluth and the Fond du Lac Reservation from, a disastrous tailings dam collapse.
There were a couple technical questions on the financial assurance here. One was, is that a dollar amount inflation adjusted, you know?
Let's see. No, this is, let me think of this. This, I believe, is not inflation adjusted.
Okay. And well, do you know if the state is going to put this pot of money at the end of the day, the $580 million, in a separate account, or is there the risk that $580 million could be rated in the future for other uses?
Well, the plan calls for this to be put into a dedicated fund that's managed by the State Board of Investments. It's not completely clear whether that pot of money would be out of the reach of the hands of the legislature. We know through the tobacco settlement that dedicated funds have been raided in the past. So while I think the intention is that this to be, set aside, it's not completely clear whether, folks will try to get their hands on that money or not.
Okay. There were a couple questions about like who's going to make money from this. Maybe you want to explain who Glencore is.
Sure. So, Glencore is the owner of PolyMet, or at least Glencore currently owns 72% of PolyMet. Will likely own, even more if and when the mine is developed and an additional $1 billion of capital has to be raised. So as the owner of PolyMet, and the likely chief investor into the project, they would be the beneficiary of the cash flow stream that will be generated by this project. And, certainly in our economy, investors who build companies should have the benefit of the, the performance of that company. That's kind of how our economy works. What we have to make sure is that, we don't end up having Glencore privatizing the profits from this while socializing the costs, that is, dumping them on Minnesota taxpayers.
John, there's a question relating, you have a slide relating to the return of on investment of like 9.6% there. Maybe going to that slide for a moment here. And so what they did in that is what PolyMet and Glencore are doing, is that PolyMet is a Canadian company, right? So they had to submit something to the Canada, the Canadian securities officials, to show that this mine would be profitable, because Canada has had problems where these mines have gone belly up, and the country of Canada has had to pay for the cleanup costs. So they here's what they're showing, right? Maybe you want to explain about how they're misleading the Canadian securities officials here by not including these some of these the financial assurance in their analysis here.
Right. I mean, the idea of this project is to show, what is the investment required to develop the mine. What are the operating costs associated with the mine, for the 20 years of its life? And then, what is the resulting cash flow that produces? So for any of the investment geeks out there, this is known as the internal rate of return, or IRR. That's what this 9.6% return is. So it's really meant to capture all of the costs as well as the cash flow related. And it's a standard investment analysis tool, probably the most common for evaluating long-term investment projects such as this, or building manufacturing plants or other similar investments. So they're using a straightforward methodology approach. And when you're doing this type of analysis, the goal is to identify and include all of the costs. The problem is that PolyMet knew that the returns wouldn't work. So they made assumptions that the trust fund payments would not need to be made. And it's not completely clear the rationale for that, because under Minnesota law, to meet the Minnesota State Sulfide Standard, they have to allow for treatment of the acid mine drainage that occurs from that, because it will impact wild rice and other, provide other issues in Minnesota waters, you know, increases mercury discharge, that sort of thing. So this is a really important part of the project and necessary to meet the requirements that the state has put on the project. But through the magic of, you know, a simple assumption, they've said that, well, we're not including those cash flows, or we're not including that cost in the project. So, I mean, to me, it is really, you know, says that they're either lying to the state that they intend to make these payments and comply with the permit, or they're lying to their investors by saying that, you know, we don't ever intend to make these payments, so don't worry about them.
Great. John, if you would move the slide to the sort of call for action at the end there.
Sure.
Now we've had a few questions related to the political issues here, and I'll address a couple of these. So the second point, the prove it first legislation. This is legislation that is modeled on what Wisconsin had for 20 years, and that the prove it first legislation in Wisconsin required, before you could operate a sulfide mine, that you would have to show that it had operated for 10 years safely in a similar environment, and that it had been closed for 10 years, again, in a similar environment. So that that you would, you know, essentially prove it first. If such a mining is so safe, show us where that's been done. That legislation was introduced this year, similar legislation in Minnesota. And there will be a big push by Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness next year to have that legislation passed. So, so we want to prove it first. This is a way of showing that if this type of mining is so safe, show us where it is. And if it's not so, if it hasn't been done safely elsewhere, then Lake Superior and the Boundary Waters should not be guinea pigs for this. There have been several questions about, you know, about elected officials here as well, and yes, it is absolutely the case that our top elected officials are still pro PolyMet, including Governor Walz, and so we are encouraging Governor Walz, all of you, to communicate with Governor Walz to have him take a look at this situation. He did not create this situation; he inherited it, and we think when the facts are presented that reasonable minds would agree that this is an unreasonable proposal for Minnesota here.
Right. I think we also know that, you know, recent polling has showed that the majority of Minnesotans oppose copper sulfide mining in Minnesota.
And see, there are some other questions here. You know, again on the PolyMet issue at the federal level, there. The legislation that Betty McCollum has proposed to withdraw mineral leases would not, which would take away copper sulfide mineral leases, would address the twin metals issue, but would not address the issue of PolyMet. So that federal legislation could be broadened to include, in addition to the Boundary Waters watershed, include Lake Superior watershed. That's how that legislation could be amended to protect Minnesota from, and our country from the threat of the PolyMet sulfide mine here. There is, you know, there are, let's see, maybe other question here. There's something, a question that I'm a little confused. What is the financial risk to taxpayers if the instruments are guaranteed? And so, John, that kind of goes back to your chart there where that orange gap here, and show why why the pretty language is really masking a huge risk to Minnesota taxpayers. So why is this orange a risk to Minnesota taxpayers?
Sure. There's really two reasons. One is that surety bonds and letters of credit tend to be more shorter term financial instruments, and in particular, letters of credit have to be renewed either every 1, 3, or 5 years because they're essentially backstopped by the borrowing ability of the company. So there's a risk that at any point in time, those letters of credit are not renewed. And if they're not renewed, then the only recourse the state has to protect taxpayers is to essentially draw on the letters of credit, which will bankrupt the company. And so if that happens, that would essentially, what that means is that the state would be forced to shut the operating mine down in order to protect, in order to draw on the letters of credit. And frankly, we don't believe that any governor in Minnesota would ever shut down an active project to do that. There would be, about 300 people, working on this project, and essentially the governor would have to throw those people out of work, which would be politically untenable.
Great, John. Maybe we can go back to the very last slide of the presentation here. Maybe one more here. I know we've had a lot of questions here. I want to respect everyone's time here. Please feel free to email the friends here with additional questions that you may have on this, and either myself or John will answer those. I want to thank John for that excellent presentation, and I want to thank our co-host Lee Vu for all the work she's done in helping get this program together here. This presentation is recorded, and we will be able to send that to you. So you will receive an email with a link to the recording of this, and we'll also make it available on our website for you to access through our website. Our next presentation will be in 2 weeks, in 2 weeks here on Wednesday, June 3rd at 12 noon. And again, that is tips and tricks for planning your Boundary Waters canoe trip. And as of Monday, the Boundary Waters will be has been open for overnight paddling. So you can, in fact, begin to plan and go on your overnight canoe trip into the Boundary Waters. So thank you so much for being here and being part of this presentation. Again, you are the strength of Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. Have a great rest of the day and a great Memorial Day weekend. Thank you so much.